Hey there, it's Silver. This is Untamed Tactics. I was interested in this one because I really enjoy tactics RPGs in general, so it's always nice to look at new ones, especially indie attempts at the genre, because there are a lot of really good ones out there to find. And this one kind of caught my attention because of some of the unique mechanics it has, as well as the really nice art style. So I guess the first thing to talk about is the art style. It's got this sort of anthropomorphic animal style going on, where like all the characters are animals of various kinds. They're all nicely drawn, and they all have that sort of classic puppet animation style, which does a pretty good job, I think. And the overall art style of the world itself is really pleasant to look at because it's super colorful. All the colors are really saturated. It's got a lot of really big, overly bombastic particle effects for things, which I like, honestly. In a tactics RPG, I like it for like spells and attacks and stuff to look big and flashy. I think it looks nice. So I like the overall aesthetic that this game is going for. And another good part of that is the music. It's actually got some really nice music. It's a relatively chill soundtrack that has a sort of viewing a lost adventure atmosphere, if that makes sense. And that's kind of, that goes along with the story. This game does have a story. It has some randomized elements, but it is not a roguelite, I should mention. This is not the kind of game where you die and restart from the beginning. It does have some randomized bits in that, you know, a lot of the loot you're getting is going to be random, and a lot of the areas in between the important story beats are going to be randomized in a sort of Slay the Spire style of map, but the big story important scenes themselves are actually a story, right? They tell a story in a linear order. They aren't randomized. And I do like that sort of thing. You know, having some randomization in between the more important bits is fine because it makes it a little bit different each time. But then having the more hand-designed story aspects not be randomized, I think is a really good idea. And using a bit of a hybrid of those tactics, I think manages to tell a story relatively well, right? Because you can't tell a story that's purely randomized. It wouldn't make any sense. You've got to have some concrete, solidified elements in between all of that. And the game does, I think, a pretty good job of giving you a more linear storytelling sense while also having some randomized side stuff along the way. So this is a strategy RPG with a very small party. Usually you've got about 3 people with you. And although there are some maps where you will have some AI-controlled allies as well, but for the most part, the actual party you're going through with is always 3 characters. And 3 for a strategy RPG is a really small number. You know, a lot of tactics RPGs, you've got at least like 8 or 10, maybe 12 characters to manage, even pretty early on. So only 3 definitely puts a lot more of a, I guess, a character development focus on those 3 characters. And although you are only taking 3 with you each adventure, you do have more than that to choose from. And every character has a couple of different jobs that they can actually do, which will determine their ability pools, their starting abilities, as well as the ones that they can get from leveling and stuff like that. And I think the main intention here is to make the game very replayable. You know, you're supposed to be able to replay a lot of the areas because they do have that randomization element to them with different characters or with the same characters with different jobs, so they have different abilities and different roles in the party and stuff. So this means that the game does have a fair amount of build variety, which I always appreciate in a tactics RPG, or really any RPG in general. I love build variety. So it's nice to see that there's a bit of a focus on that in this game. And the way that it mostly does it is everyone starts out with a couple of usable abilities, and then as you defeat enemies and stuff, the party will gain levels, and the party levels up as a whole. Characters don't level up individually. You have a sort of party experience gauge that fills up after every major battle event, so then when it's full, everyone levels up at once. And there are different things that you can get when you level, but one of those things is new abilities, and every character has a limited number of slots for abilities that they can actually equip. So you'll start out with just a couple, but as you level up, you'll get more, and eventually also there's a meta currency aspect where you can gather this sort of research points, and one of the things you can use these points for is unlocking more of the character's ability slots so they can have a total of more abilities per run. So that's another kind of interesting roguelite aspect, even though the game isn't one of those. So I find that kind of interesting that they're using that idea, and I think it actually works pretty well. You know, being able to gather a meta currency through multiple runs that are actually story-based and not purely randomized, and then sort of starting on a new story-based run and being able to use that currency to improve your characters this time and stuff, I think it actually works pretty well. I think the concept of a meta currency doesn't need to be exclusive to a game that has permadeath and completely restarting a run every time you die. I think it can work in games like this and have it be more of like an upgrade system in a traditional RPG instead, and I think they've done a pretty good job with that here. So you'll get a choice between several different abilities that you could give a character, and you got to fill up your limited skill slots with a sort of deck of abilities that you think they can use best. So this means that each run, each sort of quest, you could be choosing a bit of a different selection of skills depending on what was offered to you or what the character's equipped with this time that may affect their stats in different ways to favor other skills over certain ones and stuff like that. There's a bit of like, I guess you could almost call it like a deck building element. It's not really, you know, this is not a deck builder, but it is something kind of similar to that, in the sense that you're given a choice between multiple different things, and you are encouraged to use those selections to build a specific build for that character each time. There are also a couple of other things you can get while leveling, though, and some of these things you can also just get as loot. Like, when an enemy dies, sometimes they'll leave behind a treasure chest, and some maps might have a treasure chest on them already by default, and you gotta make it over to them, that classic tactics RPG thing that makes you really nervous. But some of the other things you can get include runes, which also have a limited number of slots, and runes offer you sometimes new sort of skills as well as new passive benefits. They can be really strong. Oftentimes they are improvements on something the character can do, or maybe they're something like, when you attack an enemy that already has a debuff, you get a big burst heal or something like that. They have quite a few different uses, and they also come into various different grades, and some of them are even like reaction attacks and stuff, because characters can come with reaction attacks. A lot of enemies will have them. Some of your characters can have them by default, but you can also get them from equipping runes, and reactions are, they're what you think. When you get attacked in a certain way, it automatically triggers the reaction like a counterattack, and there are certain runes that are specialized in this. And you can also get these gems, and gems are modifiers to current skills. Basically, you can only equip these on skills you already have. They go in those slots, and they modify the skill that they're equipped onto in various different ways. These also come in several different grades, denoted by color and a Roman numeral in their name to let you know how strong they are. And these are really nice. These allow you to specialize your skills to do specific things. You may have an assassin character that has a sort of backstab skill, so you put a rune on that character that gives them a bunch of health when they do a crit, and then you put a gem on their backstab skill that ups its crit chance by like 50% or something ridiculous like that, and you suddenly have like a crit machine that you've built to be like a specifically assassin going around backstabbing people character, which is pretty cool. This means that all of these systems tend to work together really well in order to allow you to create a specific build for everyone that feels powerful and feels like they're gaining in power over the run. Feeling powerful, by the way, is very important because you are always outnumbered in this game. Considering there are only 3 of you, this means that almost every battle you're going to have more enemies than there are allies, so you do have to be quite strong in this game because it actually is relatively challenging, I feel. Not like unfairly difficult, it's just a little bit challenging here and there. There have been some fights that I've had to try multiple times. By the way, when you lose, like I said, you don't die and lose everything. You actually get the chance to retry the fight if you want to, and just keep trying until you win. Every character does have a certain number of skill points in battle, and you can actually use as many skills as you have the AP for. So you're not limited to like some movement and like one attack or whatever. You can use as much AP as you've got, although you can only use each skill once per turn. And your movement points and your AP are separate, by the way. Your movement points are those little sort of purple paw print symbols, and the AP are the yellow diamonds. AP does roll over, by the way, and there are in fact some skills that cost so much AP that you actually can't cast them at the beginning of battle because you only start with 3, and some of them may cost 4 or 5, so you actually have to deliberately end the turn with some remaining so that the next turn you'll have more than usual. One really unique idea this game has is the parlay system. This is not something that I've ever really seen quite like this in an RPG before. So you've got that orange gauge at the bottom of the screen. It builds up as you do damage, and once it's full, you can parlay with any enemy on the battlefield. And this is not limited by range, by the way. You can parlay an enemy all the way across the battle if you want to. And parlays have a number of cards. Every character has a sort of a deck of cards, and when you parlay with a character, it will draw 3 of their possible cards at random, and you can choose one. And every enemy has a sort of mood, and different cards will always have some extra effect that they do if the enemy is a specific mood. So they might be excited or afraid or something like that, and different cards will have an advantageous effect if you use them on a matching mood, but you can use any of them. You don't have to use a matching one. And parlay cards are extremely powerful. There's one that like debuffs all of an enemy's stats all at once, and if it matches their mood, then it debuffs them even more. There's one that completely removes an enemy from the battlefield instantly as if they were defeated, no matter how much health they had, but if it matches their mood, it instead converts them into an ally for the rest of the entire battle. They're on your side. So yeah, parlay cards are very good, and a good playthrough of the game is going to involve using this to your advantage as often as possible. The parlay mechanic is extremely important to the combat and helps to even the odds in the fact that there are so few of you and so many of them. The fact that you have these extra powerful options you can pull out at just the right time, it helps you out a lot. Now, aside from battles, there are also some other things you can do. When you're on the map screen, again, it's like a Slay the Spire style, like node-based map, there will be the big, important, non-randomized story-based things, but in between those is going to be a web of other stuff you can do and visit. And some of these aren't battles. They may be dialogue decisions, or they may be moments of self-reflection for a character that permanently increases one of their stats, or it may be just some loot that you find that, is some extra gear someone can equip, or it may even be like some sort of confrontation where you can choose to be kind of a neutral party and maybe talk things out and maybe get a reward for it, or maybe you just make someone really mad and end up in an extra battle that you didn't have previously or something like that. There are a lot of dialogue options that involve sort of trying to solve problems between other people and seeing if you can keep the peace or indeed make things worse and end up in a battle. So overall, runs do have a fair amount of variety to them. Even though this is a very battle-heavy game, a lot of it is combat, there are still some things outside of combat that do happen. So what about criticisms? Well, I have a few. One of the things is the interface for this game is a little bit odd at times. It does a lot of popping things up over other things and preventing you from reading them. Like, for instance, when you're casting an ability, the ability name will be in the middle of the screen, and you won't be able to read a lot of the times the tooltip that happens when you hover over a character. When you're casting a skill and you hover over an enemy, it'll show you like the projected amount of damage and the damage type and stuff like that, but usually that's buried under the name of the skill or the thing that's select an enemy or whatever, so you can't actually see it. There are several menus and tooltips in battle that do this, that sort of overrun each other. I've also noticed that some of like the options menu actually appears underneath other buttons on the screen, so you have to sort of click around them carefully. It's a little bit weird. You think it would appear over all of the screen buttons, but it doesn't. And that's just sort of a general problem. I feel the interface needs a little bit of work in some aspects. There are just some parts of it where things just overlap on each other a little bit too much and sort of cloud some of the information that you need. I also think that some of the difficulty can be a little bit weird. For the most part, I think it's a pretty fair game, but there are a couple of instances where I think maybe things are a bit odd. Like, for one, sometimes so many enemies get to go before you that the first time you ever get to act in a battle, half of your team is already like half dead. You'll start a mission where you're not supposed to fight anyone and you're instead supposed to escape on the opposite side of the map. It's just an escape mission, but by the time you actually control your characters for the first time, they're already on like 50% HP because so many of the enemies get a turn before you. The turn order is a little bit weird in this game. It feels like it really heavily favors the enemies, and the initiative makes it to where your characters very rarely act early, so that the very beginning of battle most of the time is just you watching for a while, because the enemies get more turns before you a lot of the times. And also sometimes enemies act out of turn. Like, it'll show enemy A, your character, enemy B, and then enemy A will go, and then enemy B will go, and then your character can go. It's like it skipped you for a second in order to allow the enemy to go before you. It's really weird. It does this fairly often. I've noticed sometimes the turn order displayed at the top of the screen is not always correct, and sometimes it skips over certain characters in order to allow enemies to go before you and things like that. There's also one part of the difficulty that I really dislike, honestly, and that is that for some reason it seems like every enemy in this game has like an 80% crit chance. Enemies constantly crit you for massive damage in this game. It's actually a rarity sometimes for a battle to go by where enemies aren't constantly critting you. In fact, I think in almost every battle I've been in, every single enemy has had a super high crit chance and is constantly doing huge burst damage. So this means that some victories feel almost like luck because you didn't get crit enough times to die instantly before you can actually use your characters. So, because when you combine the really high crit chance with the fact that enemies often get to act before you, you can see the recipe for disaster there, where sometimes you take like massive, huge amounts of damage and it doesn't feel like there's anything you could have done about it. I really feel like the enemy crit chance needs to be toned down a little bit, because it just seems kind of ridiculous how often they do massive crits to you. It feels like every turn, basically, and it makes the battles a little bit unpredictable, but not in a good way. They're unpredictable in the sense that you never know how powerful an enemy is going to be. They might have relatively weak attacks, but considering how often enemies crit in this game, suddenly they're a huge threat when they shouldn't necessarily be, because all their damage is like multiplied drastically due to how often they're critting your characters. It's just a little bit strange. But aside from the pace being relatively slow due to the large gaps in between actions and animations and stuff, and the fact that the balance is a little bit wonky here and there, I still think it's a pretty solid SRPG that does a good job of telling a fun story with some randomized elements that don't necessarily detract from its ability to tell that story. So yeah, overall pretty solid, although maybe a little bit odd at times in terms of its pacing and balance, but still worth a look. So if you want to check it out, I will put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.